Good morning. Can you hear me back there, TJ? Thank you. So I am a property manager, and part of my job as a property manager is that I get to do several reserve studies every year. So I will be covering reserves, what the law requires, and why it is important. Reserves are extremely important because poorly funded reserves can result in special assessments, large maintenance fee increases, and lower property values. So I'm going to be talking about how we can avoid that. And so today I will cover how to determine whether you have adequate reserves, reserve studies and the different components of reserve studies, what Hawaii law requires for reserve funding, and the benefits of having an accurate and well-funded reserve study. So most condo associations have two funds that they use to pay the bills. The first is the operating fund, and then there's the reserve fund. So we don't commingle the two. The operating fund is for the day-to-day operations, for things such as employee payroll, general maintenance, utilities, the day-to-day things to run the property. The reserve funds are designated for capital repairs. Now, the law describes reserve funds as funds for the upkeep, repair, replacement of those parts of the property, including but not limited to roofs, walls, decks, paving, and equipment that the association is obligated to maintain. So again, we don't commingle the two. How do you determine whether you have adequate reserves? Well, you perform a reserve study. A reserve study is a long-term capital budget planning tool. Essentially, a reserve study is an analysis of the association's physical assets and analysis of the association's current financial situation. So it tells you, here are the assets and the useful lives of everything that the association is required to maintain. And it looks at how much money you have in the bank. And it tells you, this is how much money you have, and therefore you should be putting this amount of money away in order to pay for all these projects when they come due. So HRS 514B 148 governs budgets and reserve studies. And in the handouts, I put a couple of bullet points in there straight from 148. It says, a budget shall include total replacement reserves as of the date of the budget. The budget shall include the estimated replacement reserves the association will require to maintain the property based on a reserve study performed by the association. So the association is required to perform a reserve study. It's right there in the law. A general explanation of how estimated replacement reserves are computed, and whether computation was based on percent funded or cash flow plans. So a little later, I will talk about the difference between percent funded and cash flow. Some examples of components you'll see in a reserve study: roofing, asphalt paving or seal coating, painting. A lot of times before you do painting, if you're in a wood structure, you got to do wood repairs. If it's a concrete building, then there's concrete spalls that need to be repaired in conjunction or prior to painting. Window replacement is a big ticket item. Heat pumps, boilers, chillers or cooling systems, elevators are a big ticket item, and plumbing. Last month, I was at a CEI seminar, and the topic was aging buildings. And the presenter was saying that 5 to 10 years ago, we didn't see a line item for plumbing in our reserve studies. And that's totally true, because on the East Coast, your cast iron waste lines will last 80 plus years. And so these buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s, we're now discovering that in Hawaii, we have maybe a 40-year lifespan on cast iron. And a lot of these associations weren't planning on that. They were thinking, oh, we got lots of time left before we got to do the pipes. Well, now today, because several buildings have had to go through a plumbing replacement, some buildings, their insurance have told them that we're going to drop you if you don't, do your pipes because they've had so many leaks. So now reserve studies should have a line item for cast iron or galvanized pipe replacement and even copper line replacement. There's three main things you need to determine for an accurate reserve study. The first is which components belong to the association. The second is when the components will need to be replaced or repaired. And the third is how much will it cost to repair or replace these components. So the first part, how do you know which components belong to the association? Well, you look at your project documents. Your declaration provides a description of the property. It provides a description of the common elements. It provides a description of the limited common elements, and it also describes the apartments. So based on the project documents, we're able to determine, okay, this is the association's responsibility to maintain and repair, so therefore this goes into the reserve study. Sometimes your project documents are silent on certain items. A very common one is windows. Windows is a huge ticket item. In a high-rise building, windows could cost millions of dollars, but sometimes your project documents don't clearly spell out windows. So when we have these scenarios where things are silent, you definitely want to ask your condo attorney, to clarify things for you, because you want to make sure that you have these things in the reserve study. And if it's not a common element and you know it's a big ticket item, it's definitely important for you to tell the owners, look, windows are not a common element. And the windows in our building could be very expensive to replace. So you should be budgeting, maybe this amount of money to replace your windows somewhere down the line. Sometimes limited common elements are not the association's responsibility to pay for. Some documents spell out that limited common elements are the responsibility for a homeowner to pay for, and some project documents say a limited common element is the association's responsibility. So you definitely want to check that and make sure your reserve study accurately reflects what your project documents say. And sometimes there are components in a building that are only utilized by a portion of the ownership. For instance, I know of a building that has a chiller system that only services one stack of the building, and their project documents say that that stack of the building is responsible for the repair and upkeep of that chiller system. So when you have these scenarios, you have to do a second reserve study specific for the items that is only pertinent to a portion of the building. And that way, that second reserve study will allow you to separate the costs for the owners who are responsible for that item. How do you know when the components need to be replaced? A lot of times we look at the past history. If you paint your building every 8 to 10 years, you know it has a useful life of 8 to 10 years. Manufacturer manuals and warranties often spell out a useful life for an asset. There's a lot of published data that you can find to determine a useful life. What I like to do is I like to ask contractors. If I got a service contract, say for a heat pump, and I got somebody coming in quarterly that's maintaining the equipment, I like to ask them, hey, how long do you think I have left on this heat pump? When do I need to replace it? That's a very good indication of useful life. You can ask third-party professionals, architects, engineers, reserve specialists to provide you this information. And you can also do comparisons with other buildings. If you got booster pumps in one building that's same size, same brand, and you know their useful life, you could use that for yours. Third component for an accurate reserve study, how much will it cost? How much will it cost to paint the building? How much will it cost to do the pipes? How much will it cost to replace the windows? I like to get contractors' estimates. Sometimes if you're doing a reserve study and you ask a contractor, hey, give me a bid for this, and they know you're not actually going to do the work, it's sometimes hard to get that. But if you have service providers who are looking at things regularly, that's a good time to ask them, how much will it cost? And there's also published data, and you can go out to contractors, architects, engineers, and ask them for estimates to replace certain assets. And I think that's the best way to accurately predict how much you'll need to put away is when somebody tells you, well, I will charge you this much money to paint your building. Put that amount in your reserve study. Hawaii law has two methods to calculate reserves. The first is the percent funded method, and the second method is the cash flow method. So the percent funded method says fund a minimum of 50% of the estimated replacement reserves. So this is a simple calculation. If you have an asset that costs $100 to replace and it has a 10-year life, if you put $10 away for 10 years, when it comes due, you'll have $100, you will be 100% funded. Well, the law requires you to be 50% funded. So if you put $5 away for 10 years, you will have $50. You won't have enough to replace that component. 50% is a statutory minimum. But if you're funding to replace an item, you need to make sure that you put enough money away such that you meet the statutory minimum and you have enough money to do the project when it comes due. The other method is the cash flow method. This is sometimes known as the pooling method. It's a minimum 20-year projection to fully fund its replacement reserve requirements each year. Basically, cash flow looks at projects year to year. It pools them together, and it looks at total costs. So it'll say 2017, you'll have 100,000 in projects. 2018, you'll have 200,000. 2019, you may not have anything. But it looks at year to year and how much money you'll need in the bank to fund those projects when they come due. The difficult thing with cash flow is that it allows you to take your reserves down to $1. So when we're doing a cash flow plan, we like to set thresholds such that, you know, maybe you don't ever go below $250,000 or an amount that is comfortable, you know, for your association, because things happen, you know, sometimes things cost more than you anticipated, so you definitely want those contingencies built in. Some helpful tips to performing a reserve study. Well, first, the law puts the burden on board members to collect reserve funds. So if a board member or the board is not comfortable performing the reserve study, you can outsource it to a reserve specialist or maybe even your management company to perform the reserve study. But the burden is still on the board to collect the reserve funds. Reserve studies should be updated annually. If you complete a project in 2017, your next reserve study should show that project has been recycled and put back into a future year for the next time it comes due. You need to adjust annually for changes in interest rates and inflation. You need to add details and notes. This is extremely important because things change, people change. You know, sometimes you change management, sometimes you change, you know, resident managers, sometimes board members change, and your reserve study is a 20-year prediction. And so a few years from now, somebody else comes in, you want to make sure that they have the notes that, you know, you use to come to the determinations that you came to. So in my reserve studies, on my note section, I like to put, you know, if I have an asset that's, you know, serviced regularly, who services it? You know, how often they come? If they give me an estimate, you know, to replace that, I, you know, put that in there. Hey, this number we have in a reserve study came straight from a contractor. This is how much they'll do it. You know, this is how much they'll charge to do the work. So it, you know, the notes is definitely important. Add contingency funds. Don't just fund the minimum. Like I said earlier, things sometimes cost more than anticipated. Labor rates go up. Petroleum goes up. So if you are funding the statutory minimum or you're putting the minimum away, you know, just to get by, you know, likely, you know, if things change, if, you know, a project costs more than you anticipated, you may not have enough money to do it when it comes due. And one thing that I often see is boards don't plan for professional services. So if you have a large project, you may need to hire a spec writer. You may need to hire an engineer or an architect. You know, these professionals cost a lot of money. And then sometimes you need project oversight, project management. Management could cost 10% of the contract. So if in the reserve study you're only funding for the contracted price, how are you going to pay for these professionals? So you need to take that into consideration. Put the time in. I don't necessarily think reserve studies are very difficult to do, but I do feel that they take time and effort. If you walk the property, if you carefully look at the projects coming up in the next 3 to 5 years, really evaluate, do I have enough money? Is it going to last me 5 years? Do I need to move it up 3? You know, put the time in, and that really will allow you to, you know, have an accurate reserve study. Preventative maintenance is very important. If you want to maximize the useful life of a component, you definitely want to do the regular maintenance. The best example I can give is asphalt paving. So your asphalt typically lasts maybe 20 to 25 years, but you should be seal coating your asphalt maybe every 4 to 5 years, and that could definitely maximize the life of your asphalt, possibly even extend it. You know, maybe you can get 35 years out of it if you're constantly, you know, doing the preventative maintenance. Benefits of a reserve study. Owners should pay their fair share. That is the purpose of a reserve study, is that everyone contributes to it. If you're, you know, say I live in a high-rise condominium for the past, you know, 20 years that has an elevator, and then I sell my unit and the next person comes in and they get special assessed to replace the elevator, well, I just benefited from the last 20 years. I never had to pay a cent to, you know, replace it. So you really want to be collecting, you know, a fair amount every year such that you have the money, you know, to do it, and it's not the future owners who are burdened with having to replace certain assets. Reserve studies affect the ability for owners to obtain new or refinance loans. So I know a lot of lenders have minimum requirements that they look at prior to providing a homeowner a loan on the property. I know VA and FHA, I believe last time I checked, was 10%. They want to see 10% of your budget being contributed to reserves. So if you have $100,000 budgets, you have to have at least $10,000 of that going into reserves. Otherwise, your homeowners may not get lending, you know, from certain institutions. Reserve studies can avoid special assessments, loans, large maintenance fee increases, which affect sales, property values, and delinquencies. Deferred maintenance costs more in the long run. Reserve studies serves as an effective communication tool. They help prioritize business plans and preventative maintenance needs. Reserve study demonstrates compliance with state statute. Like I said earlier, the law requires an association performs a reserve study. Provides evidence that the board members are complying with their fiduciary duty, and minimizes chance of litigation. Board members are volunteers. If they don't perform a reserve study, they're putting themselves at personal liability, which John talked about a little earlier. And a few things from the Hawaii statute that I want to point out. The reserve, so this comes straight from the law. Reserve funding method shall not be used to circumvent contributions required in the reserve study. So basically, you have to provide an accurate reserve study. If you know and your elevators are going to cost $300,000 to replace, put $300,000 in the reserve study. Don't cut that down to $200,000 because you want to save some money. Too often I see boards trying to work backwards. They don't want a maintenance fee increase this year, so let's manipulate the reserve studies such that we don't have to have a fee increase. Let's push all these projects down the line so we don't have these funding requirements. So that is a clear violation of the law. Reserve funding plan cannot reflect future loans and assessments. Well, that's the purpose of reserve studies, so you don't have to get an assessment or a loan. Loans and assessments are there for emergencies or things that you weren't, anticipating. So you can't put a loan or a special assessment, 5 years out in your reserve study. That's a violation of the law. And finally, no association or unit owner, director, officer, managing agent, or employee of an association who makes a good faith effort to calculate the estimated replacement reserves for an association shall be liable if the estimate subsequently proves incorrect. So it's not a crystal ball. It's difficult to predict the future. So that's why I said if you or that's why I said don't fund the minimum. Add for contingencies. Put a little extra in there, and that way you'll have a well-funded reserve. And hopefully, if you plan for these contingencies, you'll have enough money to do the projects when they come due, and you won't have to go back to your ownership and say, hey, we didn't, plan properly, so I'm sorry you got, a special assessment this year. So in conclusion, well-funded reserve may prevent special assessments, improve property values, and ensure everyone pays their fair share. So that concludes my section. Milton